Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Ave Maria Press Professional Development Webinar Series. In this webinar, seasoned teacher Amy J. Catapan will demonstrate how we can learn from the examples of the saints when it comes to handling disruptive, disinterested, and otherwise challenging students. My name is Erin Pierce. I am the interim publicist at Ave Maria Press. Everyone in the audience is muted today, but you are able to ask questions. Questions will be sent. You can submit them here in the question panel of the GoToWebinar, and I'll read as many of those as possible at the end of the presentation today. This webinar is being recorded, and I will send you a link to the recording via email tomorrow. With that, I would like to welcome and introduce our presenter today. Amy J. Catapan is a middle school English teacher and Catholic speaker, retreat leader, and author who has written or contributed to several books, including Sweet Jesus, Is It June Yet? That's the most fun title to say. Chicken Soup for the Soul, From Lemons to Lemonade, the award-winning novels Angelhood and 7 Riddles to Nowhere, and her newest book, A Saint Squad for Teachers. She also hosts Catholic Live for the Catholic Writers Guild. Catapan has appeared on The Katie McGrady Show on Sirius XM, EWTN's Bookmark, Catholic Faith Network Live, and the Sunrise Morning Show. Her writing has appeared in Highlights for Children, Hopscotch for Girls, Pockets, and Catechist. She also served as the host for Shalom World TV's Book Ed. Catapan earned a bachelor's degree in English secondary education from Marquette University, a master's degree in instruction for secondary education language arts from Northeastern Illinois University, and a doctorate in curriculum and instruction from Loyola University, Chicago. She has spoken at a variety of conferences, including NCEA, the Los Angeles Religious Education Congress, and C3. Amy, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you for having me, Erin. I'm so happy to be here with everyone.
Wonderful. I'm going to go ahead and make you presenter.
Awesome. Make sure we get this into full screen for everybody.
Yep.
It does not look like we are quite in full screen mode, does it?
Not yet.
Let me try this again.
There we go.
There we go.
All right, you can take it from here.
All right, thank you so much, and thank you for your patience, everyone, as we got the screen straightened out there. I am so happy to be with you. And is the screen, did it change again?
It did. It went to presenter window again.
All righty, let's try one more time.
No problem.
Let's try hitting this button instead, see if this makes a difference. All right, let's hope it stays this time.
That looks good.
All right, well, thank you everyone for joining me today for Teach Like a Saint. As Erin said, my name is Amy Cattapan. I have been a middle school teacher for over 25 years now. I actually started off as a high school English teacher, and I'm really excited to share with you what I have learned about the saints. I've been studying them for the last few years, specifically saints who worked as educators. So as Erin said, my first book for Ave Maria Press was Sweet Jesus, Is It June Yet? And I wrote that, believe it or not, prior to the pandemic. I was in the middle of my doctoral program at Loyola, and I was teaching full time. And it got right to about this time of the year, was spring break time, and I was feeling very burned out. And I didn't know if I even wanted to finish my doctoral program. And so I decided to do what anyone who's been steeped in Jesuit education and Ignatian spirituality would do. I decided to go on a 5-day silent retreat. And so I went away to a Jesuit retreat house outside of Atlanta. And I decided I was going to take this time to decide how God was calling me to be an educator at this point in my career. But even before I could start that retreat. I sat down in prayer in my home and I thought, okay, Lord, I'm going next week on this retreat. What do you want me to do? And I pretty quickly heard this little thought flutter through my mind to teach a book about, or to write a book about teaching like Jesus. And I thought, well, what on earth does that even mean? At that point, I considered myself a novelist. I wrote fiction for kids. I didn't see myself as a nonfiction writer or as a writer for teachers. But I thought, well, I guess I better go pray about this. And the fruit of that retreat ended up being Sweet Jesus Is It June Yet? And then after that book came out, you know, I found it very helpful to work my way through the pandemic, remembering the lessons I had learned by studying Jesus as a teacher, as a rabbi. But I felt like I needed more. I am one of 5 children in my family, but I'm the only girl. I have 3 older brothers and a younger brother. And growing up in the 80s, that meant I was introduced a lot to Star Wars and Star Trek. And so as I was going through, or as we were really kind of coming out of the pandemic, and I was feeling like teaching was still hard, the thought that kept running through my head was actually from the old 1960s Star Trek show, where the Captain Kirk is asking the engineer to, I don't know, make the ship go faster. And Scotty, in his wonderful Scottish accent, just keeps saying, "I've got to have more power, Captain." And I wish I could do a better Scottish accent, but I kept thinking, Lord, I've got to have more. You know, I'm so grateful for what you taught me, Lord, by, you know, encouraging me to look at your son as a teacher. But I feel like I need more. Teaching's still hard, even coming out of the pandemic. And all I can say is our God is a good and gracious and merciful God, because he started to put in my path all of these books about saints. And I just was surprised really about how many saints were educators and how many saints were patron saints of schools and school children and education of the poor and of universities and of scholars. There were so many saints who were involved in education, either for a short amount of time or really for their whole careers. And I thought, well, maybe there's something here. Maybe God is throwing these saints in my path so that I can learn from their example, so I can have them as sort of these mentor saints to help me out. And as I kept track of these saints and took notes on them, I realized I'd built up a little saint squad. Now, this is not actually my first saint squad. This is my second saint squad. My first squad of saints, I like to call my Italian sister saints, because when I was working on my doctorate, I went to Rome, Italy for a few of my electives. See, I was smart when I chose my university for the doctoral program. Loyola Chicago has a campus in Rome, so I got to go over for these 2-week classes for 3 different summers. And as I was studying over there and visiting the churches, you know, I'm seeing statues of St. Catherine of Siena everywhere, and I'm visiting the beautiful St. Cecilia Church. And I realized there were all of these Italian women saints, St. Frances Cabrini, St. Rita of Cascia, that I felt a certain kinship with. So they became sort of my first saint squad. And then I decided to make a little squad of teacher saints to help me out. And they've really become good and dear friends that I call on every day. Like every day when I'm in my classroom, I start with prayer before the kids walk in, and I walk around my room and I think about the kids who are going to sit in these seats. And I ask the intercession of so many of the saints who are in this book. Whoever is coming to mind that day, whoever I think I need the most help from, I will ask them to pray for me, to pray for my students, and to be with me there in the classroom. So I'm really excited to share with you a few of my favorites. There are 45 of them, as the subtitle of the book says, 45 heavenly friends to carry you through the school year. So I'm going to introduce you to just a handful of them today. So I put them together in little groups because in the book they're divided into chapters based on themes. So I've kind of made this presentation into 3 mini little chapters. We're going to talk about 2 saints, and specifically how they dealt with the overachievers and the underachievers among our students. So we'll talk about Sister Thea Bowman and St. Dorotheus. Then we're going to talk about 2 saints who I've called on a lot this past year, not going to lie, St. John Bosco and St. Jean-Baptiste de La Salle, because they dealt with the age group of students I have middle schoolers, and particularly middle school boys. So we're going to talk about how they handled those kind of mischievous preteen and young teen boys. And then we'll wrap up our time today talking about St. Francis Xavier Cabrini. Perhaps you've seen or heard of the new movie about her, but what doesn't come out in that movie is really that she was a teacher first. In fact, she started as a public school teacher. So we're going to talk about her as an educator as well. So let's get started with the saint who's actually the first one up in the book, and that is Servant of God, Sister Thea Bowman. And if you haven't gotten a chance to get to know her, I highly encourage you to get to know her. I really feel like I have a special kinship with her. We have a few things in common, Sister Thea Bowman and I. Now, she's a 20th century saint. She was born in 1937 in Mississippi. Her dad was a doctor and a Methodist, and her mom was an educator, a teacher, and then a principal, and her mom was Episcopalian, so she was not raised Catholic. But growing up in the South in the early half of the 20th century, as an African American, she could only attend either a private school or one of the segregated public schools. So she started in a public school, and her mom, an educator herself, and her dad, a doctor, very well educated, realized they had a very bright daughter on their hands and that she was not being challenged well at the segregated school, because of course those schools for African Americans, they were not as well funded, and they just didn't have the resources that the other schools had. So when the Franciscan Sisters of Perpetual Adoration from La Crosse, Wisconsin came down to Mississippi and started the Holy Child Jesus Mission School near their home, Dr. and Mrs. Bowman jumped at the chance to sign up their daughter, Bertha, she was known as at the time, to sign her up. And she was about in 6th grade at the time she started there. And she really thrived. She also really loved the joy and the humor of the priests and the religious sisters at this school. So much so that she was won over to Catholicism and on her own became Catholic. By the time she was 15, she decided she wanted to join the Franciscan Sisters of Perpetual Adoration. Her parents were not such big fans of that at first, and at age 15, she went on a hunger strike until her parents agreed to let her go. Now, this was a huge move for this Mississippi girl. She had to go all the way up north to La Crosse, Wisconsin, to become an aspirant. And that was not without its challenges. It was a very white community. She was the first African American to try to enter the convent, and she got some pushback even from the sisters within the community. But her charm, her Southern charm and her joy won them over. And then they realized pretty quickly she also was very bright and that she would make an excellent teacher. So they decided to train her as a teacher and get her her first teaching job in a nearby school. Again, that was met with some pushback. But the principal there was very wise, and they knew if people just had a chance to get to know her, that they would be won over by her. And once again, her Southern charm and her joy and her sense of humor won people over. She ended up teaching at all the different grade levels: elementary school, high school, and even at the university. She had a bachelor's, a master's, and a doctorate in English. So she was very well educated, and she became one of the founding faculty members for the Institute for Black Catholic Studies at Xavier University in Louisiana. So what did I learn from her? What are some takeaways maybe that we can use in our own classrooms and our own careers as teachers? So here are 3 things that I try to keep in mind when I remember Sister Thea Bowman. First of all, find materials that work for your students. So she had a number of struggling students, especially when she taught high school. She found that the kids really struggled with reading, especially those high school boys. But she noticed they were fond of comic strips. So she ended up assigning writing assignments about character development with the characters in the comic strips. And I just thought, wow, if she were teaching now, she probably would be using graphic novels in her classroom. And I know I've heard from some educators who are like, oh, graphic novels, that's not real reading. I'm like, listen, it is. You do have to read the words and read the pictures, which is so important for kids to get to read body language and things like that. And I'm thinking if it was good enough for Sister Thea Bowman to use to get high school boys to read, then maybe it's something we want to consider too, finding what works with them and then using that to scaffold them up to where we want them to be. Sister Thea Bowman, like me, was also a singer. I love to sing in my church choir, and she sang a lot as well. In fact, she was known for just singing in the middle of her lessons, when she would give talks like she did to the US Catholic bishops in 1989. She would start singing. In fact, she got the bishops to sing We Will Overcome with her. So think about ways that maybe you can add music into your lesson and how that might also reach your underachievers as well, or your reluctant participants in your lessons. And it's okay if you're not a singer as well. You don't have to be like Sister Thea Bowman, who ended up with a 50-member student choir, and they recorded an album of African American spiritual songs. But there's lots of ways to add music. For example, I love to use timers in my classroom. I find it helps a lot with keeping students on track. And I try to pick out timers that have music. So if I want them to be energized, I might pick a timer that has a little bit more energetic music. If I want them to kind of mellow out, we're going into a longer writing session, then I'll pick a timer that has some more calming music. There's tons of that lo-fi study music that you can find online. And it's just a little way to add some music into your lessons. And then just as Sister Thea Bowman reminded the bishops that she was bringing her whole self to the church, that she was a gift as she was as an African American woman, as a religious sister, I think it's a good reminder for us to think about how our students bring their whole selves into the classroom. Do we let them bring their cultures in? As a language arts teacher, I'm often asking my students about their other languages. What do they speak at home, or what are they studying, and how can we use knowledge of those languages with our knowledge of English language arts? Okay, another saint you might not have heard of before, Saint Dorotheus of Gaza. So he lived in the early 6th century. He was very well educated, had a classical education, but he wanted more of a secluded life. So he decided to found his own monastery where he would take in young monks and teach them and guide them in the ways of the faith. And he had a very interesting relationship with one of his students. And I think if we study St. Dorotheus and his student, who also became a saint, St. Dositheus, we can get a sense of maybe how to handle some of our more high achieving students who maybe suffer from anxiety. So St. Dorotheus mentored this St. Dositheus, who, when he was a young man, was kind of a St. Francis of Assisi or a St. Ignatius kind of a character. He was a little bit, wild and, interested in the ways of the world, not the most pious young man, until he went to Jerusalem. And in Jerusalem, he saw a painting of souls tormented in hell. And it so terrified him that he said to a nearby woman, "What do I have to do to avoid that, to avoid torture in hell?" And she told him simply, "Pray and fast." So then he was on a mission to figure out how could he pray and fast to avoid that. And that led him to St. Dorotheus's monastery. So he entered the monastery there, and he struggled. He wasn't like quick to adapt. He would some days revert to his old behaviors, and then the other days swing wildly to the other side and just think he was the worst person and was inconsolable in his grief. And this reminds me of some of my higher achieving students who, if they get the A instead of the A plus, they think that like life is over and they're just in so much trouble at home. And sometimes we just have to say, that's not the most important thing, right? We need to respond with compassion, right? We need to remind them they're more than just their grades. So St. Dorotheus, what he did with St. Dositheus was just take him step by step. First of all, he would say, okay, what do we want to tackle today? Oh, you're eating 6 pounds of bread a day? Because that's what St. Dositheus was doing when he showed up in the monastery. He was eating 6 pounds of bread a day. Okay, well, that's gluttony. Now, we're not gonna, totally go cold turkey here. So he encouraged him to just make small changes, cut down the amount of bread he was eating every day until he came to something a bit more temperate, right? And then remind them of their true identity. And for Saint Dorotheus, again, he would feel awful when he would do something bad. When his temper would get the better of him, he would go off to his cell in the monastery and just be inconsolable. And Saint Dorotheus had to come in and remind him he was still a beloved child of God, right? He could repent and God would be merciful and take him back. All right, let's talk now about two of my favorite saints who dealt with young men, young boys, Saint John Bosco and Saint Jean-Baptiste de La Salle. So they have sort of been my mentors in classroom management the last couple of years here. So Saint John Bosco was born near the Italian Alps. He's from the 19th century. His dad died when he was very young, so he was really raised by his mom. And as a kid, he was very playful. He liked to play tricks on his friends, and he learned to juggle, and he learned to do acrobatic tricks. But he had a calling very young in life as well. At only age 9, he had a dream. And in this dream, in front of him was a group of very unruly children. And the Blessed Mother appeared to him in this dream and said, "This is your field. This is where you must labor." And in front of him, these unruly children went from looking like wild animals into lambs. So when he grew up, he became a priest, and he got to live out that calling in his dream when he was sent as a priest to Turin. Now, he started doing some prison ministry. Now, you might not think that has anything to do with children, but it actually did, because there were 12 and 13-year-olds in the prison system in Turin. At that time, Turin was going through a time of great industrialization. And as a result, a lot of people were coming to Turin looking for jobs. Unfortunately, there were more workers than there were jobs. And so a lot of families were without work, and that led to some boys being out in the street, committing petty thefts, gambling, and some of them then landing in jail, which is where John Bosco first started to meet them. And he realized that there was going to be a cycle here, that these boys that he was seeing in prison, once they got out, they were probably going to revert back to a life of crime and end up back in prison again, right? And he wanted to break this lifelong cycle of incarceration, but he knew to do that, somebody needed to intervene. So this is when he decided to start working with these young boys. And it began very simply. Like, one time there was a boy who ended up in a church, and he just wanted to get warm. And the priest inside was yelling at the boy, but John Bosco happened in at the same time, and he intervened, and he spoke to the boy gently, and he said, "Listen, why don't you come back on Sunday with some friends? I'll teach you some prayers, and I'll do some juggling for you." And this became the start of his oratories. And his oratories were times where kids could see him do his, his magic tricks and his acrobatic acts and his juggling. But first they had to be there for the prayer time and for the lessons. And he ended up just attracting this huge number of boys. At one point, he had 300 boys outside an orphanage where he was a chaplain. And he realized they couldn't do that anymore. There wasn't a big enough field. So eventually he bought a home. His mom ended up coming and being like a housekeeper for the boys who actually boarded there. Some of the boys just traveled from near the neighborhood. And he continued doing these prayers and these lessons with then these celebrations afterwards. So what can we learn from him that we can apply? So there's a few different lessons I've tried to keep in mind. One is when we need to redirect student behavior, redirecting with respect. So once he started opening schools, John Bosco told his teachers never to lash out in anger, and to try not to reprimand in front of a large group. So whenever he could, he would do his redirecting privately. In fact, there's a little Italian phrase I mentioned in the book. He offers una parola all'orecchio. A parola is a word, orecchio is the ear. So una parola all'orecchio is basically a word in the ear. In other words, he would quietly redirect the boy or offer a word of encouragement instead of admonishing him in front of the whole class. And when I first learned that he did this, it reminded me of some coworkers I had who I would see in my planning periods if I was walking through the hallway and they had a class, that they would be talking to a student quietly out in the hallway. And I just thought, what a beautiful thing to have that private discussion outside in the hallway, near the door, so they can still keep an eye on what's going on in the classroom, but to have it out there instead of in front of everybody, right? So the kid can kind of save face a little bit. I think that's a wonderful thing for us to keep in mind. And I know I've been using that in my classroom whenever I can, either pulling students outside to talk to them or waiting until class is over. Sometimes just saying, that's not appropriate right now. We'll talk more about that when class is over. So it's not interrupting your class time. It's not taking away from everybody else, making it clear something was inappropriate, but then dealing with it respectfully outside of class time. Another great lesson is mixing the fun with the serious, right? He would celebrate with the kids after he did the lessons with them. So for example, in my school, one of the things we do, we call our Fun Fridays. So we have a little study hall at the end of the day. And on some of our Fridays, we'll celebrate with a little Fun Friday. And so students who have been keeping up with their work and haven't had disciplinary referrals might get a little extra recess time or might get a little game time if the weather is bad outside. But it's just a little way for the kids to have something to look forward to celebrate with them. I know some other teachers who, they'll set a goal for the students, and if by the end of the week they meet that goal, they take the last 10 minutes to do a fun activity at the end of class. The other thing I try to keep in mind, and this was very hard for me when I was a new teacher, is not to be afraid of a little bit of noise. I started my career believing like classrooms should always be very quiet, there shouldn't be a lot of talking, but if you're going to do collaborative learning, of course there's going to be talking. Things might get a little loud from time to time. And St. John Bosco was all about that, right? In fact, there's this great quote in the book that I try to keep in mind all the time. John Bosco used to say, shout, sing, dance if you want. The important thing is that you don't offend God. Nevertheless, don't damage my walls too much. So I just love that idea that, it's okay to have music. It's okay to have fun. It's okay for there to be noise in the classroom, but is everybody safe, right? Nobody's getting hurt. The walls aren't being damaged, and we're not offending God with what we're doing. In fact, this was a post I saw on social media recently that I thought, oh, this is totally in keeping with St. John Bosco. One of the teachers posted this on We Are Teachers. One of my favorite ways to deal with a disruptive student is to ask to speak to them in the hall. They're usually expecting to be yelled at, but instead I ask if they're okay. I tell them I'm concerned because they're usually not disrespectful. That's just not who they are. So I know something else must be going on. If they say they need to get a drink or visit the nurse, I let them and thank them for talking to me. Even if they say nothing's wrong, their behavior almost always improves. It's hard to keep misbehaving towards someone who has shown genuine concern for your well-being. So I just saw that recently on social media and thought I'd share. That's a very John Bosco-ish kind of way of handling classroom management. Now, St. Jean-Baptiste de La Salle had a similar age group of students and kind of a similar technique, but he was almost 200 years before St. John Bosco, and he was from France. So he lived in the late 17th century. And at that time, schools in France were really only for boys and for the wealthy. So the grammar schools were often attached to universities, and Latin was the primary language used. Occasionally, there were some charity schools attached to parishes, but even then, families had to buy supplies for the schools, and poor families couldn't afford them. There were also schools dedicated just to writing, but those were also very pricey. And so St. John Baptiste, when he looked at the situation, he realized education should be for everyone, not just for the wealthy, and that it should be very practical. So he decided at his schools, he was going to have the teachers teach in the native French. Seemed much more practical for poor families that their children would be learning in French versus Latin. And he was going to teach reading and writing because he knew those were the keys to learning everything, really, right? You get your reading and your writing skills down, and that can take you to all the other subject areas. And he had a very vocational focus, right? If they were going to be clerks, then they should learn how to keep records, right? Like basic accounting records. So like John Bosco, he believed respect was a two-way street. He taught his teachers that they had to model respect first. If they were going to expect it from their students, they should give it first. He told them to think of themselves as God's ambassador to students, right? If you're representing God for your students, it's probably going to change the way you're going to talk to them. Reminded me a lot of Mother Teresa and the way she would see the face of Christ in the poor. Jean-Baptiste sort of had that same sort of attitude, that the teachers should see Christ in all of their students. He also, like John Bosco, advocated for avoiding snap judgments and harsh responses, which I know can be really difficult. And I'm a Catholic, I'll give my own little confession here of an example of when I had to stop myself mid-snap judgment just last week. So I'm on spring break right now. And of course, last week, all the anxieties were coming up about spring break coming. Everyone is very excited, but also very worn out. We'd had our standardized testing the week before, and everyone's nerves are just a little bit frayed. There were parent-teacher conferences going on. And I have some boys, I'm sure some of you in the classroom have some boys like this too, who like to wander a bit, and they have to go sharpen their pencil like 3 times within 10 minutes, and then blow their nose a couple of times, right? And so I have a boy in this one class period who's often getting up more than he probably really needs to. And so I had to keep asking him to, okay, you've sharpened your pencil enough, go sit down, go sit down. Then he asked if he'd go to the bathroom, and I said, okay, sure, but there's a boy out already, so just wait for the other boy to come back. So I'm going on with my lesson, and suddenly I see this boy out walking again, and I was like, why are you? And I had to stop. And I realized it was because the boy in the bathroom had come back, and the boy I was about to reprimand was doing exactly what I had told him to do. I had asked him to wait until the other boy came back, and then he could sign out to go to the bathroom. But I was like midway through snapping back at this boy before I had to stop myself and go, oh, wait, he's doing exactly what you asked him to do. You said he could go after the other boy came back. It's so hard to do in the moment, but this is where I think we can ask the intercession of St. Jean-Baptiste de La Salle and say, oh, please pray for me that in these moments when my patience is getting frayed, that I take a moment and breathe, right? He always said, don't give a punishment in a moment of anger, right? I can think of another example recently too, where 2 girls got into a fight. One girl was very, very mean to another girl, said something very inappropriate. And I talked to them out in the hallway privately, right? Following the example of John Bosco. And then following the example of Jean-Baptiste, I said to the girl, okay, I'm gonna have to think about what the consequence of this is gonna be. So you and I will talk more about this later, because I needed that moment to calm down about what she had done. One last thing I learned from him is the real world applications for our assignments, right? He taught in the native French. He taught the things kids would know. He had a very vocational focus. So anytime I can make my assignments a bit more real world, and I'll give you one quick example. As an English teacher, of course, I assign a lot of essays, but so much of what kids do nowadays involves video. So I ended up turning one of my research projects into a documentary film the kids make. They still do all the research skills that they need to do. They still have to write up what they learned about the person they're researching, but then they make a little documentary film about it, which for them, for this YouTube generation, and some of my students have their own YouTube channels, making a video is much more applicable to their real lives than writing some kind of 10-page research paper. I've heard some English teachers refer to them as video essays. All right, let's go to our last saint for this webinar. Let's go to Saint Frances Xavier Cabrini. I don't know how many of you may have seen the new movie about her. I've seen it twice. I love it, but there's so much more to her life, and they did fictionalize a few things in their movie, but she was a teacher first. So she was actually born a couple months premature. So she had health issues her whole life. Her parents worried about her from the time that she was born. She wanted to become a missionary sister. So she was a huge fan of Saint Francis Xavier, the Jesuit missionary priest. That's why she ended up taking Xavier as part of her religious name. And so she tried to enter a few convents, but they rejected her because of her health. And because she couldn't enter those convents, she actually became a public school teacher in Italy. In fact, if you live near the Chicago area, I recommend you come to the shrine of St. Francis Xavier Cabrini here in Chicago. They have a beautiful shrine with a little museum area, and you can even see a copy of her Italian public school teacher's license hanging up in the museum area. So she started there in the public schools as a teacher, and she won over the students with her firm but gentle approach. And then her organizational skills started to be noticed. Her priest noticed how good she was as a leader and asked her to take over a nearby orphanage that had kind of fallen apart and needed some strong leadership. And that is the start of where she founded her own order of sisters, the Missionary Sisters of the Sacred Heart of Jesus. So they actually started with schools and orphanages in her area of northern Italy in Codogno. And then she wanted to go broader, right? Of course, she wanted to follow in the footsteps of St. Francis Xavier, and she wanted to go to the east, to China. And this is where we get the famous, saying that Pope Leo XIII said to her, not to the east, but to the west, which wasn't what she wanted, but it's where she believed that God was calling her. And so she came over to New York and ended up opening 67 schools, orphanages, and hospitals all around the world with her missionary sisters. Now, what you might not know, if you haven't studied her life much, or if you've just seen the movie, is she really believed that the Lord would give her what she needed. So in the early days in the schools and orphanages in Codogno, there was a creditor who came looking for payment, and the sister who went to get the money from their cash drawer found the drawer empty. So she came back and she said, Mother Cabrini, well, we don't have the money for the creditor. And she took a moment and she prayed. And then she said to the sister, I think you must have been looking in the wrong spot. Go back and open the drawer again. And sure enough, the sister went back and opened the drawer, and there was the money. And it was exactly what they needed to pay the creditors. When she went to Rome to finalize her order, to get like approval for the order, the rule of her order, and to open a school in Rome, she met with a cardinal. And the cardinal wasn't so sure, not quite as antagonistic as you might see in the new movie, but the cardinal wasn't quite so sure that she was really supposed to open a school in Rome. So he said, why don't you ask God for a sign? If you get 500,000 lira, then it'll be a sign from God that you're supposed to open a school here in Rome. So she went away with her sisters, and they were very disappointed. And she told her sisters, do not worry, the Lord will change his heart. And sure enough, when she went back to meet with the cardinal again, he told her not to open one, but 2 schools in the area around Rome. And this was a theme. If you study more of her life, you will see it over and over again. She would go to a city to open a school, to open an orphanage, to open a hospital. She would pick out the building she wanted before she had the funds. And sure enough, the funds would come, right? She always told her sisters the Lord would provide. Sometimes, though, she had to get out of her own way. So the second thing I have on the screen here is sometimes we have to get out of the way of our own ego. So there was one story of her wanting to start, I think it was a hospital in the South, and she was going around trying to find the donors. Again, she had the building all picked out, but she didn't have the money, and she wasn't getting the money from the donors that she was hoping to get. So she finally said to her sisters, you stay here. We must not be getting the money because I'm in the way. So I'm going to leave, go back to one of the other towns she had her sisters in, and God will provide. And sure enough, she left, and what happened? The money came shortly afterwards. And I just thought, what a great example of humility St. Francis Xavier can be for us. We're not the only educators our students are going to have. I teach at the middle school level. They have plenty of other teachers during the day. If there's a kid I'm struggling to reach, maybe I just have to get out of the way. Maybe somebody else is going to be the person God's going to use to reach that kid. And then the last thing I want to bring up with her that I find really important is that we do need to take breaks from time to time. And St. Francis Xavier Cabrini was sometimes forced to do it for her own health issues. For a while, when she was working on the hospital here in Chicago, her health got so bad, her sister sent her out to one of the suburbs here in Chicago, Park Ridge, and she had such a good restful time there. She ended up buying a plot of land out in Park Ridge, and for a while, that was a retreat center for her own sisters. She also used her many voyages back and forth across the Atlantic, because she had places going to North America, South America, and in Europe. So she traveled back and forth across the Atlantic many times. She had a fear of water because of her near drowning as a child, but she used those times as retreat times. Again, she was a fan of Ignatian spirituality. She was friends with a lot of Jesuit priests, so she knew how to take time to do Ignatian style retreats. And if you haven't been on a retreat in a while, I highly recommend that you do it in whatever way you can, whether it's just an evening of reflection. I know there's a wonderful Jesuit retreat house near me here in Chicago where they do evenings of reflections, and they do weekend retreats that are basically like 36 hours. I encourage you to take those times, even if it's just small moments of prayer in your classroom on your lunch break, those last like 5 minutes. Skip checking the email, skip grading the papers. They will all be there when you come back to them, and take a little time to reconnect with God, to ask for the intercession of the saints. They're your squad, they're on your side. They've been there, they've done that. And I hope that you really see them as friends in heaven that you can call on during challenging times. So I know we want to leave some time for some Q&A. I've got my website up there just in case anyone wants to contact me about leading retreats or coming and doing in-service day talks. Please feel free to reach out to me. I love to come and talk with my fellow educators.
Thank you so much, Amy. I'll let you catch your breath here, and invite all of you that are on with us to submit a question that you might have for Amy. You've got her attention. What do you want to know about teaching like a saint? I was a high school theology teacher for 24 years before coming over to Ave Maria Press, so I can totally relate to so much of what you've said, but most especially how inspired I feel. And I hope those listening feel the same way. And there's really so much that we can learn from the saints and take to heart, to be the teacher that God wants us to be, right, for them. What do you think has been the most life-changing lesson that you have learned from the saints that has made you a better teacher?
I think for me, the importance of staying connected to God through prayer and surrendering. That's been a big theme recently. Letting go and letting God, right? Placing my students in his hands, because there's so much we as educators cannot control. I can't control whether or not their parents take their devices away from them at night so they can get a good night's sleep. I can't control whether or not they're getting a good breakfast at home before they come to school. I have just, especially as a middle school teacher, I get 40 minutes. I get only 40 minutes with 20 some kids in a room at a time. I can only do so much, but that doesn't mean it isn't worth my time to plant whatever seeds I can, and let God do the rest, right? Let him water them. Let him, pour the Holy Spirit down upon them like sun shining down on little seedlings, right? I have to, at some point, offer up what I can, plant the seeds that I can, and then surrender the rest and let God take it from there.
Yes, that can definitely help you through the difficult days.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you're acknowledging there too that it's not necessarily your perfectly crafted lesson that is the most important, right? In that 40 minutes, but it's the students and all of those things that they bring into the room, right? Sometimes we used to call it the baggage, right? But
Yeah.
the lack of sleep, the no breakfast, those sorts of things, and being attentive and aware of that and compassionate about that.
Absolutely. Yeah. It is so much more, I think, about the relationships, which I know we talk a lot about relationship building, and that's not a panacea. Sometimes on social media, I'll see teachers, kind of scoffing at this idea. Oh, the administrators just tell us, build a good relationship. It's not a panacea. It's not gonna, fix everything. But it's also, for me, I think one of the most rewarding things about it is when you do develop a strong relationship with a student and you can celebrate the successes with them. Even, I'm 3/4 of the way through the school year now. If I can take a moment and appreciate where I was with some of the students at the beginning of the school year and where some of them are now, and the changes I've seen in some of them, and how I've worked with their parents to help them, then I think we can be grateful for the differences that we are making. I think it's very easy as teachers for us to focus on the things we wish had happened and hadn't, and forget that we are really making a difference. It's just so hard, I think, in the middle of the school year to take time and remember it, because we're thinking about all the other things we need to do.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yes. So I love your chapter headings in your book. They really cover so much. Creative teaching techniques. You were just talking about relationships. Saints who built strong relationships. You talked a little bit about the challenging students, advocated for change, social justice for their students, teaching in times of crisis. I bet many of us on here have been involved. I remember when 9/11 hit, exactly where I was in school, right? Let's see, saints who kept going when the going got tough, embraced lifelong learning, whose prayer lives kept them going. Another something that you just mentioned here, and following your vocation wherever it leads.
Yeah, you're reminding me of all the times of crisis one, when the going gets tough. We heard during the pandemic, oh, this is unprecedented. But I kept thinking, not entirely. I mean, we never had to shut down schools like we did. But as you just mentioned, I was teaching too when 9/11 hit. I remember what it was like that day with students in the classroom. There was nothing quite like that prior to that, but I made it through that. I was early in my teaching career when Columbine happened. I was teaching when Hurricane Katrina hit, and even though I teach up in the north, that was big news for us up there as well. There have been so many challenges over the years, and when you look at the saints, they were going through all sorts of things, their own difficult times. Like I talk about Blessed Miguel Pro, who was studying to become a Jesuit priest when there was great persecution against Catholic priests in Mexico, and he actually ended up having to flee Mexico during his formation as a Jesuit. And all Jesuits spend part of their formation doing ministry, often in schools, often teaching. So here he is trying to learn how to be a teacher while on the run, right? And then he ends up coming back. He was in Scotland for a while. He ended up being sent back to Mexico, and then trying to then serve as a priest and evangelizing in secret while priests are being arrested. Like this isn't the first time that we've had challenges as educators.
Right, and won't be the last.
Yes.
Well, I just want to say thank you so much for spending this time with us today. I am sure everyone else is taking all of these little takeaways or these nuggets and saying, how can I implement this in my classroom tomorrow, right? Or maybe this summer, maybe some things that I can really work on this summer to apply to my next year in the classroom, my next year lesson plan. So thank you for sharing all of that with us. And as always, we like to share a little discount with all of you to purchase Amy's books, 25% off. So either a Saint Squad for teachers or Sweet Jesus is June yet, or both. And if you're interested in any kind of bulk copies, please reach out to me and we can work through that. And Amy mentioned too, her speaking engagements. Sounds like really would be a great retreat, professional development day to talk about the saints with the teachers and get them inspired for the school year. So once again, thank you, Amy. Thank you to everybody on with us. And I invite you, if you have not signed up, to receive the webinar email invitations, then you'll find that in the email that I send to you tomorrow. Sign up for it and you'll receive all of the email invites for the webinars. All right. Well, Amy, after this week, have a wonderful spring break. Everyone, a happy Holy Week and a happy Easter. Thank you
Thank
all.
you.
Bye-bye.